but nonetheless, I'm going to kick off and remind you that the aim of this symposium was to analyze changes in gender relations and in food linked to urbanization in a context of fast urbanization and in a context where there are very different ways to grow food in the fields, in gardens, in Africa and Latin America. There is also issues related to undernourishment or malnourishment or obesity and overweight, etc., etc. Processed food, food that is bought on the streets, in restaurants, etc. So we wanted to look at what all of this meant when it was put in perspective with gender related issues. And we could have had a symposium entitled "What does urbanization what does it not change in terms of gender relations?" Urbanization is definitely a challenge, and that's what we wanted to look into more specifically yesterday and today. And after having heard all these fascinating presentations, I take away three main areas that seem to be key areas of change, gradual sometimes, it's true, but change nonetheless. And I'd like to take a bit of time to talk about this. First of all, the trading space. Secondly, the digital space. And thirdly, the final space that I'll come back to in a minute. So first of all, the trading space. This is where markets actually take place. This is where food is sold and bought. People in cities eat what is sold on the market. So it's a very important space. And restaurants are very developed in urban areas. And it's in that space that it would seem that gender relationships are changing and power struggles are changing. We saw it with the expose on the Amazon. We saw it, Paul Adolin, with the markets in Abidjan. We also heard about the same thing with Jung Lee and the Hansik in Korea and the Korean cuisine in Buenos Aires, the Baques of Colombo. Paula also told us about this with the Brazilian cross-border market. So a lot of examples, in other words, where we saw women conquering spaces that used to be the stronghold of men, sometimes even built, shaped by men. And conversely, there are some spaces where men are also conquering spaces that used to be very feminine, such as the kitchen, for example. So a two-pronged change. We talk sometimes of switching roles, and it was, I believe, very interesting, even though, of course, this transformation is far from being complete. Second space, the digital space, and there we've talked a lot about digital tools and about social media with Elise Monnier yesterday, who told us about Malaysia, as well as Anindita Das Gupta, who told us about netnography and who gave us an insight into what happened on social media and how it broke the barriers down between the inside of the house and the outside world. And it was very interesting to see that on social media there were also some mixed discussion areas. So there is not as much a division of discourse on social media. And then we talked about Netflix series. with a chef's table that Ana Rosa Santos and Aline Arrouro told us about. And Tristan Fournier gave us also an interesting insight on Naked and Not Afraid that showed us that there were different ways in which you could resist against the status quo and bring about change. And then Livia Barbosa gave a very interesting talk on meat and the meat industry. And she told us about the protest movements such as vegan, flexitarian, vegetarian movements. Now, these movements don't have the same meaning in different countries, but it was interesting to see a case study from a country where meat consumption is very important and is part and parcel of the culture. Speaking here of Brazil, of course, and yet in this country there is a protest movement that pushes back against the consumption of meat, and that challenges the whole concept of patriarchal societies. And these movements that aim at consuming less meat also point the finger at the oppression of animals, of women, etc., etc., and aims also at protecting nature and the environment. So these are the three main takeaways that I wanted to share with you. They seem to me to be relevant for all countries, even though they might take different shapes or forms. The digitalization that brings the outside world inside households, and conversely, and then the inside of households that is also bleeding out outside of the home, with, for example, these Korean women who were home cooks, but then opened up some restaurants. So this continues to and fro between the inside and the outside, which is very interesting. And finally, the issue of animal rights and animal welfare. In what Livia told us, it was very interesting to see that some were calling for an equal treatment of humans and animals. And it really raises the question of how we treat animals and nature in general. We have so far really considered that we humans were not really a part of nature, or rather that there were humans on one hand and nature on the other, and that is being challenged, and that's very interesting. So these are the three spaces that I believe are interesting to explore. They are great avenues for thought, and they show that things are changing, even though it's really very early days. So that's it for my takeaways. I'm now going to give the floor to Damien, who's going to tell us about what he takes away from yesterday and today. Well, thank you, Nicolas. I too should like to thank all the people who made this symposium possible. Justine, Florent also, who is our in-house geek who took care of all of the technical side of things, as well as Marie and Geraldine, who recorded all of the sessions. So we will be putting them up online so that they can be shared and watched by as many people as possible. I'd like to add something on an issue that we've covered quite extensively yesterday and today. It's the gender-based sharing of chores at home, especially when it comes to preparing food for the family. There were some examples where we saw that COVID-19 did change things, where there was a rebalancing of the sharing of chores at home, but as Hayat said, it was very much a short-term change, that it was down to the situation at a given time, and it probably won't change in a structural way and in the long run. But currently there is also an appetite for healthier food as opposed to junk food, so healthier food made at home, because there are some cities where, of course, it's very easy to have healthy food from a restaurant, but not everywhere. So it raises the question, who is responsible for preparing these healthy meals? And we had an answer to that question in quite a few presentations. And by promoting healthier eating, the promotion of a pre-urban, pre-industrial model, we've talked about this, but not really who actually was going to prepare these healthier meals. And it reminded me of course, family-based agriculture, which is a good idea, of course, but it raises a lot of questions. I don't know really who today would like to run a farm with their parents, their brothers and sisters. And for me, the progress that we've made over the last few decades, that we've gone into cities and that we do different kinds of jobs, is something that we shouldn't roll back. And in urban areas, it would seem that younger people, men and women alike, are not that interested in cooking. So it really raises the question of what are we going to eat and prepare in our homes in the future. Now, we've called this kind of modernity urbanization, which probably a fair assessment, but I understand that there's a case to say that it's a bit biased. But nonetheless, this evolution has to do with individual empowerment, so allowing people to get out of the farming industry. I mean, we've all here are the children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren of someone who's worked on a farm or in the fields. And likewise, we can wonder whether in the future no one will be cooking in their kitchen anymore, and if that will be also a kind of empowerment. So that's it, just to say that this is a new take on modernity in cities where there is less pressure to follow gender norms. And it was an opportunity to look at the evolution of genders with the presentation from Côte d'Ivoire this morning.
The notion of gender should not only be related to sex, but it is a lived entity. Things are more complicated. Maybe the city in this freer, more invisible space makes it possible to disconnect gender from sex. It's more related to your identity. We've talked about the forms of couple, men and women, a city, modernity. There are many other forms of couples that were not talked about. And conversely, the reversal of roles, men in charge of supplying the resources, women doing the care, and that can change. So this is the city as a space of freedom, but it's also a place where you can feel oppressed. You've seen it with the question of body, the place where body are exposed. And somebody indicated to us in their introduction how one of the main elements in this element, there's a question of the body. a number of presentations have shown the pressure that can be on bodies and the contradictory orders of food about body image. Here again, at the beginning of the 90s, a link was made between gender, city, and food. This notion of metrosexual person that used to copy attributes that are supposed to be carried by homosexual, taking care of your body, taking care of your food. That is one idea around the body. And just to conclude, bodies that have been missing in this online conference, in a way, it's disincarnated. We have seen only our faces, whereas we know that bodies can express themselves. Here, unfortunately, we've only seen people's faces. So now I give the microphone to Audrey. Audrey is going to take over. Thank you, Damien. Thanks to all for these 2 very pleasant days with you. I'd like to go back to one point which I think is important to recall in this conclusion. That goes back to what Damien was saying at the beginning. In fact, what I wanted to talk about is to say again that despite the entrance of man in the kitchen, we have been able to observe over these 2 days a certain reinforcement of the different forms of work in a context where domestic food, homemade food, traditional food is very popular. That is accentuated also by the COVID crisis and the lockdown. Of course, we know, several authors have already shown very recently that the environmental challenge and engagement has a gender. It's mainly women who do that, and this engagement can be expressed through the kitchen by women. If women take on this role, it's not because they're more apt, it's probably because they were raised differently from men, but also because they are the first to be hit by climate change and destroyed ecosystems. So I thought it was important to recall, by way of conclusion, the important physical and mental load carried by women and this desire to go back to domestic food, local food, healthier food, home cooked and quality food. So I'd like to just mention the work I'm doing with Hayat Ihari in Morocco, where several women told us they were absolutely exhausted to have to manage traditional food that has to be healthy and tasty for all of the family. And that is difficult because men, when they become interested in food, have new expectations. They can reinforce injunctions women are already subject to. Hence, those women told us that they preferred to eat out of the home in a fast food or resort to industrial products, while they recognize that this is not part of their traditional functions. That is something that can make them guilty. So just a little ethnographic detour where we see how gender relations can be complex, and it is very important to continue the work in this field. This is what I wanted to say. I give the floor to Olivier Lepierre. I am going to make sure I'm connected, says Olivier. Sorry for my technical issues. I am not going to conclude, but to finish, I'd like to say that I would like to thank the different speakers, the participants, the audience, all those who have organized Justine. We said how important her role had been in this Congress. I'd like to thank our partners. Of course, the last point I would like to deal with is related to the question of a relationship between feminine and masculine, and also the question of transformation of the masculine areas. It might be it is necessary to deal with that when we receive the communication proposals. We had an idea in mind. When we speak of gender, we talk about women, and when you receive proposals that confirms it, it's quite logical because in social sciences, we tend to focus on this aspect, the aspect of inequalities that are going to exist at the detriment of women. Social sciences tend to look towards those who have more difficulty accessing speech, word, power, legitimate. This leads me to continue the discussion started by Uga Fidolini this morning. We tend to forget that the masculine world is constantly being redefined. We forget about it because it is dominating. It's not a question of challenging this domination, but the masculine world is redefined in two ways. First, masculinity models have a certain plasticity that is going to be promoted by the urban milieu. As Damien was saying, it is marked by several elements. In the city, you can be anonymous, you have less standards in general, and this situation is itself related to the density of urban interactions, to the intensity of differentiation processes. It is also related to the multiple interpretations of masculinity standards. Those interpretations go towards the transgression of the standards, and we know that those transgressions can themselves become legitimate and dominant. Besides, the masculine area is also affected and redefined by another phenomenon. We tend to forget, indeed, that the masculine world is affected by transformation in the feminine world itself. The two co-build itself. When one area moves, the other one moves too. I think we have to take seriously this dialectical relationship between the feminine and the masculine. That's how we can understand either of those areas. It's also how we can consider gender as a social construct, distinct from biological sex. Of course, there's a physical and material dimension, and that is going to be shaped by values and standards. We know how interesting it can be to pay attention to hybrid figures like male women in the Ivory Coast, the transformation of meat in Niamey, the distribution of role during the COVID crisis in Casablanca, or the consequences of going from a rural to a more urban lifestyle. Finally, to conclude, I'd like to insist on the diversity of objects presented, to the diversity of the different approaches we've had. This symposium was centered of southern countries. We have heard researchers coming mainly from the south or who live there. It is the CIRAD's mission to promote this research in cooperation between a northern country like France and southern countries. We are also trying to look at what's going on in the south. What is it? What is the perception of the north by the south and vice versa? And this is where we have the future of social sciences, be it in the area of food or other areas. It is also the message we have decided to carry. We're going to try and continue that in the next issue of Anthropology of Food. I wanted to thank you one last time for taking part. Thank you for these very rich 2 days.